Hi, and welcome to the Spooky Isles. My name's David Saunderson, and today we're talking to retired clinical psychologist Dr. Peter McCue, who's recently published a book, one of the number of books that he's written on the paranormal. And the book that we're talking about today is Britain's Paranormal Forests: Encounters in the Woods. How are you, Peter?
Not too bad, thank you very much.
How are you coping with the lockdown at the moment?
Oh, not too bad. Just having to, you know, every time I get a little cough, which may be completely innocent, I start thinking, is this it?
I don't think you're the only person that thinks that. I think everyone who's getting a sniffle or anything like that around the place is
That's right.
thinking weird things. But we've got a lot to talk about today. Now, your book is fascinating, Paranormal Forests. I think everyone loves a haunted wood. What led you to writing this book, particularly on encounters in the woods?
Two things, really. I've had a long-standing interest in paranormal and anomalous phenomena, and I also love woodland. The latter aspect is almost a romantic aspect. I just find woodland nice, particularly broadleaf woodland, and I'm aware, that there are reports from various wooded areas. I can't say statistically that woodland is preferred for the occurrence of paranormal phenomena over non-wooded areas, but it wouldn't entirely surprise me if that were the case, because there are factors about woodland that may be conducive to unusual experiences, or even misunderstood experiences which may not be paranormal. But it wouldn't surprise me if there were an association. But certainly there are plenty of cases or alleged cases, and I emphasize the word alleged because if you've read my book, you'll know that when I've gone into cases in some depth, I've actually found that some of the evidence starts to crumble. And I didn't start out with the intention of a debunking approach, but I think one has to be objective about these things. And I like to give references, check facts as much as possible. And when you do that, sometimes you do find that cases aren't as strong as they seemed at first sight.
You tend to take an like as you say, an investigative journalist approach to your work in researching these paranormal cases. How do you distinguish fact from fiction? What are you doing? What techniques are you using to work out what's true and what's not?
Well, what I look at is the available accounts. In some cases, I'm able to speak to witnesses personally, and sometimes I'm able to get testimony that was obtained firsthand, but from another person, which in relation to me isn't firsthand, I suppose, but it was originally obtained firsthand. And I look at the different accounts. I look at the extent to which they cohere. They hang together. They make sense, and it comes down at the end of the day, I suppose, to a kind of a judgment, and sometimes it's impressionistic because it's true of other areas of life, not just the paranormal phenomena. If you talk to people about an accident, a real accident, no question that it occurred, people's memories of the accident will perhaps differ. That doesn't mean the accident didn't occur. I think there is a temptation for people who are very skeptical to sort of seize on any little discrepancy to say, oh, it's all nonsense and we can just dismiss it because there are diverging accounts. But I think it's important to try to look at the evidence from different sources to see whether it hangs together, and be reasonably balanced and objective about it, and consider a range of possibilities.
Yeah. So let's jump into some of the cases you talk about in your book. I asked you previously before we started the conversation to maybe pick three cases from the book that you'd like to talk about. So let's start with the Kentish Wood case from Chapter 2. Can you tell people about that?
Yes, this is a case one can find mention of it scattered about in the literature or on the internet. It concerns a couple called Anthony and Doreen Verney. And I'll just glance, if you don't mind, at my notes, just so I don't make too many mistakes. It's all the details are in the book there, but the Verneys were born. Anthony Verney was born in 1917. His wife in 1918. They had a background to some extent in acting, and They were both actors, and Anthony Verney was a scriptwriter, contributed to some well-known television series. They also were involved in a family business, and I think Anthony Verney had some other interests. So I think he worked with the Good Food Guide. Now they bought a cottage in Kent in 1969, and this was a sort of holiday home, and they eventually retired to it. They were living in London prior to their sort of retirement, and they retired to the cottage in the summer of 1983. And this cottage is about a mile and a half south of the village of Biddenden in Kent. And it's located in a wood called Sandpit Wood, which itself is part of a larger complex of woodland. And allegedly, shortly after their retirement, in the more specifically in the autumn, they started to be troubled by noises, vibrations, and strange lights, and they also left their cottage briefly, and they came back and found their drains were blocked. Some drains were blocked. They eventually contacted officialdom, the police, the local council, and so on, for help with dealing with this problem of noise, pollution, vibration, and what have you. And they reportedly didn't get much help. The police weren't terribly responsive. The council wasn't terribly responsive. They had a disappointing experience with the environmental health officer. At one stage, Mr. Verney reportedly employed the services of a firm of sound engineers, and an engineer came out to the property and supposedly detected vibrations with equipment. Subsequently, in January 1984, I think it was, another technical person came and supposedly recorded vibrations. But a strange thing was that when people were about, the phenomena didn't tend to manifest. But when the Verneys were at the property, they did occur. And if you take it at face value, it could sound as if they were being persecuted, particularly given the blocking of drains and so on.
What was it blocked with? Do we know what they were blocked with?
Pieces of asphalt.
Okay.
And then on a subsequent occasion, there was another blockage, and concrete was found in supposedly. Mr. Verney, at least, I'm not sure about his wife, tended to think there was some sort of conspiracy afoot, and even in his dealings with the council, referred to Operation October, I think it was, because I think the problems had more or less begun in October of that year. This is 1983. Eventually, they were deprived of sleep. Their health was suffering, and they did. Early in 1984, they found a new property, and they decided to buy a property in East Sussex, put their own property on the market in Kent, and they eventually moved out in May of that year. Their health by then was suffering badly. Now, I was lucky enough in my research, as I say, there are reports of this case scattered about in the literature, and you can find it on the internet. But I was lucky enough to get in touch with a man called Justin Williams, who'd been a journalist with the Kent Messenger newspaper group, and had contributed to a book called, I think it's Unexplained Kent, and there was a section on the case of this cottage. And the section in the book discusses the case fairly dispassionately and doesn't offer an opinion. But Justin was a mine of information and provided me with lots of source material. And when I studied this source material, it did appear that, to some extent at least, Mr. Verney, if not his wife as well, was perhaps putting a paranoid interpretation on things, and there was an element of perhaps mental illness, contributing to his evaluation of the situation, which doesn't exclude a paranormal aspect, of course. It could be that, the man was prone to that kind of thinking. There was a genuine aspect of harassment or unexplained phenomena which simply ratcheted up his
he was driven to distraction by the whole
That's
experience.
right. I think we've got to keep that in mind. However, it's a serious complicating factor when you've got this kind of consideration. Mr. Verney was in the habit of writing to government, complaining about this, that, and the other, claiming compensation, not just related to the alleged persecution at the cottage. Now, some years ago, this was before I was in touch with Justin Williams and had a sort of broader picture of the situation. I wrote to the occupiers of the cottage, the current, at the time, the occupants. It was a sort of to the occupier or occupant of, dear sir, and I said I'd heard reports, I've been aware of reports of phenomena. I should be grateful if you could give me any information. I received no reply, which doesn't entirely surprise me. And indeed, Justin Williams informed me that the subsequent owner or owners of the cottage were troubled by investigators, sort of, being intrusive, wandering around through their woods, which may have been private property anyway. So it didn't surprise me. I didn't get a reply from the occupants. The family, the occupants may have changed since then. Justin informed me that there were one or two loose ends, although he was basically skeptical about the case. He seemed to remember that the woman, I think, occupying the cottage around the time he was involved, said that someone had tried to poison her goats. Now, whether these were disgruntled investigators who'd been sent, with a flea in their ear, I don't know. In the end, I had to come to fairly sort of not completely skeptical conclusions, but certainly the case is no more than unproven. There are things about the case that aren't unique, of course. There are, in various locations in the world, and certainly in Britain, people have been troubled by reported hums or vibrations. And this is an international phenomenon, and there are various theories about what may account for it. So it's possible something like that was happening. But the trouble with this Kent case is there didn't seem to be a great many other witnesses apart from the family concerned, or the couple concerned.
Okay, well, we'll go on to the next case, which is I call a little bit more fun because we're talking the Owlman of Mawman, and I've actually been there not to investigate. I was just in Cornwall and I saw the sign. I thought, I'm not too far away. I should go visit that church. Can you tell us about the Owlman?
Yes, Cornwall, for those who don't know, is in the far southwest of England. And the church concerned is Moreland Church in southern Cornwall, not too far from the town of Falmouth. It's perched just above the Helford estuary, I think it is. Now, a man called Jonathan Downes, who heads an organisation called the Centre for Fortean Zoology in Devon, wrote a book called The Owlman and Others, in which he detailed a series of reports of people seeing, mainly girls or young women, seeing a kind of hybrid creature, a cross between a human and an owl, near the church. And being disturbed by this appearance. These sightings, I'm just checking yes, these sightings spanned a period from 1976 to 1995. Unfortunately, and again, one of these kind of fly in the ointment situations, the early reports of the Owlman, at least the first two, maybe more, came through a man called Tony Shields, who is also known colloquially as Doc Shields. I don't think he was actually a doctor, but he was known as, and Tony Shields apparently describes himself as a surrealist artist, or he even uses, I think, the word surrealchemist, or surrealchemy, a fusion of alchemy and surrealism. And he's had a kind of a fairly colourful career, a bit of a showman, a bit of a trickster indeed. And the question arises, were these earlier reports which came via him, were they genuine or not? Now, in his book, Jonathan Downes tends to give Tony Shields the benefit of the doubt. But I did see an interview on YouTube where Jonathan was interviewed by a Dr. Darren Naish, and in that interview, Downes said that he thought that the story of the Owlman was an invention originally by Tony Shields, but then no one was more surprised when it started coming true. An interesting thing, though, about this case is that there do seem to be these two reports which don't seem to have come through Tony Shields, which seem to fit the pattern of the other cases. One was from a man whom Downes refers to as Gavin. And Gavin was on holiday in Cornwall with his young girlfriend. He was quite young at the time, and the girlfriend's parents. And Gavin and the girlfriend went for a walk at the church, which he thinks was the church. Gavin wasn't absolutely sure it was Moreland Church, but probably. And they saw this sort of entity and were disturbed by it. I think Gavin was planning or has pursued a career in science and was a bit embarrassed to be associated with a story of this nature, perhaps fearing that the conservative scientific community wouldn't have a good opinion of him if he were associated with such a story. The other account came to me independently from a Facebook contact who'd started a paranormal investigation group in the 1990s, Barbara Fennell. And a member of her group was from Mullion in Cornwall and said that he knew of someone who'd seen the Owlman. And Barbara's group managed to meet the woman in Penzance and get testimony from her. It may help actually if I could read just what the testimony from from this informant. It'll give a kind of flavour of the type of event we're talking about. I've referred to the informant as Kate. That's not her real name. Yeah. One evening in late May 1978, when I was 12 years old, I was playing on the road beside Moreland Church. It was early dusk. I was late for tea, so I ran towards my home. I was with my friend Anne, that's a pseudonym. As we neared the church, Anne slowed down and suddenly started looking over towards the side of the building. I carried on, but Anne screamed at me and then caught up with me, grabbing my arm. I was about to tell her to let go and say we should go home, but she started crying and pointing towards the church. I thought she was larking about, but I could see that she was very scared. She said that she'd seen a huge man with wings. I laughed and told her to shut up, but I was a bit scared. However, we were always larking about with each other, so I thought that it was a joke. As Anne calmed down, I looked and saw a huge bird-like creature starting to fly towards the farm. It was sort of rising and taking off. It seemed 4 feet long and had a pointy beak and huge eyes. They weren't red or anything, but they were looking at us. Here's the thing, though. It had human-like features, such as a mouth and lips, but with a beak where the nose would be. The wings were the scariest part. They were almost like a huge feathery cloak, which seemed to move together as it flapped. They hardly seemed to separate, like a bird's wings do. Even to this day, I've never seen anything so bizarre as that. The feet were very crooked and pointed, but the legs were solid up to the point where the feet met. It had very dark brown feathers with silvery bits. It was truly frightening. The whole atmosphere changed and went silent, except for the sound of its wings. I'd swear that as we cowered into the hedge, it was still looking at us. Then it did a half turn and disappeared into the woods. I was so scared that I avoided being out at night in the evening, and in the evening for many months after. After all these years, I can only say that I don't believe it was a bloody owl. I've seen plenty of them in flight, but this was too large and just plain strange. I'm not stupid or blind, but no one believed me then, although there were rumours about it over a couple of years.
So did you collect that testimony, or is it you spoke to this woman?
No, that testimony was collected by my contact Barbara
Oh,
and her
okay.
group.
Yep.
But
Okay.
I think it's good testimony because it was obtained by them firsthand. As I've said in the book, one speculation, and this is very much speculation and not a clearly proven theory, I should say, is that with these sorts of phenomena, if they're genuine, we should perhaps look at their symbolic meaning, or what what message the phenomena are saying, rather than treating them too literally. And if you imagine that two possibilities. One is that we share a kind of common subconscious mind, or alternatively, that there's some kind of higher mind or higher intelligence. Now, let's say that collective subconscious mind or the higher intelligence is trying to warn young women to be careful of where they go, such as wooded places near the church.
Yeah.
One way of doing that would be to orchestrate a frightening, but not physically damaging, a frightening or traumatic experience that would put them off going there. And interestingly, and again, pure speculation here, but I read in 2012, there was a 2012 report, I think it was Cornwall Live or an internet item, about a couple of elderly men who had been jailed given quite lengthy jail sentences for sexual offences against children dating back to the 1970s. They were apparently part of a pagan group. Pagans won't like that being said, so they don't do that sort of thing. But they were ostensibly part of a pagan group. And as I say, their offences went back to the 70s. So in a sense, one could see, even though these women and girls and so on may have had frightening experiences, there may have been a purpose to them. Just speculation, but I think it's worth trying.
You're saying there was danger in those areas. So
Yeah,
there was some kind of collective consciousness of trying to warn the girls away. This is not a good place to be.
exactly. Yes. I mean, if you have, I mean, two of the if you've seen Down's book, you'll see one of the cases involves two, I think, 14-year-old girls who are camping near the church. Now, that's quite a young age to be camping out without parents and so on, and arguably it constitutes a certain risk. Also, I would suggest that if you've got, say, two teenagers camping, they'd probably, objectively speaking, be safer physically in a real wilderness. Imagine somewhere like Rannoch Moor or the outback in Australia or something.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're near a place like Moreland Church, where locals might notice you, the passing,
traffic and stuff. Yeah.
Traffic, yeah. And therefore, it's conceivable. This is just a conjecture that these manifestations were aimed at dissuading these people from taking these sorts of risks.
How do you feel your background as a clinical psychologist informs the way you do your investigations? Do you think you question people's motives more than maybe other paranormal investigators?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, to be with myself, I'd say my interest in the paranormal actually preceded my entry into more mainstream psychology or clinical psychology. So it's hard to know whether my attitude to these cases is based on very much on my training as in clinical psychology and so on. I doubtless it does have some effect. I mean, for instance, going just briefly back to the Kentish Wood case, one of the features of paranoia, you can see it in schizophrenia, for instance, is arbitrary inference. Just assuming some kind of connection between two things that maybe not connected. And in that case, Mr. Verney saw some sinister significance in the name of a nearby cottage called October Farm. It was actually a bungalow, but October Farm, and he kind of linked that October with when his problems began. Now that's such a kind of bizarre link, but it's the kind of thing you might get in paranoia. And I suppose working in the mental health field, I might be more inclined to see that kind of link, just because I've been in a privileged position. And
you also are knowledgeable about certain things that other people aren't.
Yes,
you understand that what these things are symptoms of. So I mean that would be the case. Now we'll go back to Kent, because the last one that you've mentioned was Daring Wood. Now you said that was an interesting case because it illustrated how mischievous stories can generate myths about places. So can you tell us a little bit about Daring Wood?
Yes. One can find on the internet stories about this area. Daring Wood is near a village called Pluckley, and Pluckley is not too far from Ashford in Kent. That's a town, a major town. But Pluckley is supposedly one of the most haunted, according to folklore, one of the most haunted places in Britain or England. And everywhere seems to be the most haunted place, doesn't it?
Pluckley is kind of seen as that, and I've been there, and there's quite a lot of haunted, or supposedly haunted places in Pluckley.
That's right.
So really quite famous.
And you wonder whether it's statistically any more haunted than anywhere else. But anyway, southwest of Pluckley, I think about 1.5 miles, is a wood called Daring Wood. And it supposedly has a kind of nickname, Screaming Woods, and there are various ghostly tales associated with it. And I'm just looking at one or two things so I get these details right. A book called Real Haunted Woods and Forests, a thin book by someone called Zachary Knowles, refers to an incident in 1948 when 20 bodies were found in the wood, human bodies, 11 of them being those of children. Now, when I read that, I immediately kind of I felt suspicious, because an event of that magnitude and drama would be etched on the national consciousness. It would be, in Britain, it would be up there with the Moors murders in the 60s, or the Hillsborough disaster, Sheffield. And it didn't take long checking on the internet to discover the story was a fake. And one of the things I found on the internet was, one of these kind of compilations of the most haunted forests, I think it was the woods or something. And there was in regard to Daring Wood, there was a picture of a newspaper cover from 1948 with a report of the supposed massacre. However, it wasn't too hard to discern that it was a fake, because at the top right-hand corner of the newspaper, the price was given as 1p. Now, in 1948, in Britain, the pound consisted of 240 pence, and 1 pence would be signified as 1d. Another thing about the newspaper report that showed it was bogus was a postcode. And we didn't have postcodes in 1948. Another story about the wood was that 50 years after the supposed massacre, the locals saw some sort of cobweb-like light or something hanging over the woods, and four unnamed students went into the woods that night, never to be seen again. Now, these sorts of stories get, you can go on the internet and you find people treating them as, whether they're being honest or whether they're just being completely and absolutely naive. Another sad thing about Daring Wood is that it's incurred some damage. It's managed by the Woodland Trust, and the Woodland Trust, I think, suspect that some of the people who damage the woods are people who are attracted by its paranormal reputation, but don't have a great respect for the environment. And when I visited that wood in October 2018, I think it was, and I noticed some damage, some litter and bits of, I think, 1 or 2 traces of fires. But I thought the Daring Wood case was interesting from the point of view of highlighting how myths can arise about places.
Well, they're all quite fascinating, even finding out about the ones that aren't true or the ones that are blatantly false. You've given us three examples of cases that you've kind of been able to poke holes into a little bit, but for people wanting to find some stuff that's maybe a little bit mysterious and you didn't find the answers to, is there a lot of that in the book? Are
Well,
there?
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yes, well, one of the cases I looked at was Rendlesham Forest. And I did deal briefly with the 1980 incidents involving the
Yeah.
United States Air Force, but I also referred to testimony I'd obtained in 27 from a number of witnesses who'd visited the woods, visited the woods and had unusual experiences, and some of the experiences reported could be attributed to psychological factors such as suggestion, sleep deprivation, imagination, pareidolia, and so on. However, one of the interesting phenomena reported by several witnesses who weren't always present at the same time was hot or warm stones falling down near them as they were walking along through the forest. Now, that's a sort of poltergeist-like phenomenon. It's not the kind of thing you'd expect necessarily in association with what's popularly known as a UFO case. And as I say, I got this testimony from different witnesses. They hadn't all consistently been present at the same time, and I'm inclined to believe that the phenomena that particular phenomenon is genuine.
Well, that's a really good one to end on there, because I was getting a little bit scared there because you're poking holes in all of them, but you've actually led us with something that's a little bit more mysterious and something that we could look forward to reading in the book. I'd love to get you back, Peter, because obviously I think you could talk for hours about some of these cases, and I'd be really interested to get some of your views about testimony of witnesses during investigations, because I think your own career in clinical psychology could give us some pointers into that when we're doing our own interviews. So we'd really like to get you back sometime.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you. So the book is called, for people, it's called Britain's Paranormal Forests, Encounters in the Woods. It's available from Amazon, and you've got a number of other books, and we'll put those links in the description so people can get their hands on it. So thanks very much, and you take care.
Thank you very much.